Hello there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. This is me, Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to be looking at how to make better decisions. And we're going to do this in two parts because there's a lot to say when it comes to making better decisions. What I want to do is cover as much of it as I can over the course of these two episodes. So part one is this week, and part two is next week. So it's easy for you to tune in. It's going to be like one of those MacGyver episodes, the ones where at the end of the episode, you're like, oh my goodness, MacGyver's trapped in a nuclear bomb. What is he going to do? And then a week later, you're like, oh, how is he going to survive? And then it comes da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then MacGyver comes in and goes, well, if you just eat an apple and you turn 160 degrees, then the nuclear fission opens up and you're safe. Not quite the same storyline. You're probably glad that I wasn't writing for MacGyver, but it wasn't too different to that, if you remember. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can substitute MacGyver to 24 or to most actual shows now that are binge-worthy when we find it very difficult for ourselves to actually stop listening or watching, because oftentimes it'd be very difficult to tear ourselves away from these incredible pieces of television. Anyway, today we're going to be talking, like I said, about decision-making and how to perform, and the first part will be this week. The next part will be next week. And by the end of these two sessions, again, I call them a session, I want you to be as equipped as possible to make better decisions faster and more effectively moving forward. And so today, let's start by talking about the different types of decisions that we make. And in many ways, from a corporate perspective, whenever we talk about making decisions in an organization, there's the autocratic decision, and that is a decision where the individual makes the decision. Now, this, by the way, can also happen in a family where one member of the family is the one who makes a decision in a particular context. There's also the consultative situation whereby the individual looks for support or checks in with the rest of the team or checks with some experts. Or again, in the case of a family, the decision maker, the mom or the dad, might check in with the children or might check with their partner as to what they think is the right thing to do. There's the democratic, where they all vote, and whichever option, let's say we're going to the cinema or we're going to bowling, whichever wins the vote is what goes, which is difficult if it's 2-2. So really that means that the parents should have a third kid just to be able to be the tiebreaker. And if that's not an option, then they're just going to have to maybe make it more autocratic than it was before. And then there's the consensus where they all have to agree, or at least, so not all of them have to be super enthusiastic, but they all have to be open to agreeing with this idea. And that's, again, consensus. And it's important for us when we're making decisions to understand these different types of decisions, because oftentimes, depending on the context we're in, some decisions need to be made in certain ways and others need to be made in other ways. So for instance, whenever the stakes are high and time is of the essence and you really need an answer, sometimes the autocratic approach is the best approach, or sometimes the democratic approach will work well for that. But whenever you're in a situation where relationships are most critical and everyone needs to feel heard, the democratic or certainly the consensus approach will be a very advantageous way of doing things. And whenever the decision maker doesn't have all the information or facts and wants to make sure that they incorporate other people's perspectives in, then the consultative approach is useful. So I just wanted to start by offering up those different types of decisions, because I think before we even get to decision making, we first and foremost need to figure out what are the different options or the different things that we need to be able to look at when we're making a decision. What are the types of decisions we need to make? Next, let's talk about the different levels of decision making. And when I say levels of decision making, I'm talking about the actual impact of the various decisions that you have to make. So for example, there's what we call the operational level of decision making. And that is really making a decision about what you're doing right now in this moment, about the operations of the way in which you're performing. Again, this could be at an organizational level. Whatever decisions that you make about your job in this specific context might be an operational decision. And that's well and good. In a family situation, again, if you're making decisions from a family perspective, that might be a small decision that happens on a regular enough basis. The second level that you can make a decision at is a tactical level. And that is really what to do about this specific situation. So you come up against a situation, problem, some issue, and you have to make a decision to figure out how to deal with it. And that's what we call a tactical situation. Again, that could be relevant to a family as well as a business. But the third type of level that we can have in terms of decision making is strategic. And this is a decision that you make that has long-term consequences. So once again, you need to be considering what decisions that you have to make are strategic. In other words, they have a long-term impact upon what goes on in your life, what goes on in your business, what it leads to for you. So by identifying whether or not this is a strategic, it's a tactical, or it's an operational decision, that will lead you to understanding the best way possible what amount of time needs to go into it. For most operational decisions, first of all, understanding if it is operational as a decision, that will let you know, well, who needs to make it, because that will provide pretty much an advantage in the sense that almost anyone can make an operational decision if you trust them to that extent. Then a tactical decision would really be reserved for people who are able to handle these situations as they arise. So it might be their position needs to be such that they can make a decision that has implications upon how you deal with a problem or challenge. And then you have strategic, and this is really reserved for people who will have a say in the overall direction that you're going in. So what are the most important strategic decisions that you have? For example, as a parent, where to send your children to school is a strategic decision, right? How to deal with your child's poor report card is a tactical decision in that context. And then operational decision is what to get for lunch, what to make for lunch for your children or whatnot, or for yourself. And then in a business perspective, a operational decision might be which report to do today or which report to do first in a context. A tactical decision would be how to handle this particular meeting, which is a difficult conversation you have to have. And then strategic would be, what are you going to do, like studying that night course, or what network are you going to build so that you can have more of an advantage the next time you go for promotion? So all of these are different types of decisions, and thinking them through means not only who's best to make them, but also what considerations do you need to be thinking about when you're making these decisions. So it's a good idea to understand what is the type of decision and what is the level of decision before you make the decision. Another thing to recognize are some of the skills that you need to become a great decision maker. These are skills such as being analytical, the ability to analyze a situation, to understand what's going on with the data that you're looking at. It means using your intuition, and this is your ability to be able to understand what is your gut telling you. What do you feel like the best approach is? Now, not to let your gut always rule the roost. Sometimes you want to be able to, well, most of the time you want to listen to the data before you listen to your intuition. And that's why analysis of the data should come from before you use your intuition. Your intuition should just confirm it or expand on it. But you want to also be good at reasoning things through, using logic and walking through a sort of an understanding as to how this will play out and what reasonably we can expect to happen if we make decision A versus decision B versus decision C. That also means you need to be having good judgment. So you need to have a good sense of what this looks like, a good ability to spot the difference between something that's smart versus something that isn't, between something that looks good versus something that doesn't. And finally, you need to have the skill of communication, being able to clearly communicate the decision that you're making, but most importantly, being able to articulate and communicate why you made that decision. And that's vital, because great decisions are not great just because they lead to results, as we'll get to in a little bit. Great decisions are great because they can be replicated, because they're the decision that, based upon the situation and context you were in, it was the best thing to do. And in order for it to be the best thing to do, you need to be able to walk people through why you made that decision. You need to show people your work. And that in turn will allow them to benefit from your insight, as well as you to benefit from your insight, because it means when you're in that future situation, you're able to know exactly what you did and why you did what you did, which is imperative. So once again, analysis, intuition, reasoning, judgment, and great communication are critical skills you need to work on in order for you to be as effective as possible at making decisions. So that is so far what we have. We've looked into the skills, the types of decisions you need to make, the levels of decisions, quite a lot of different information here. But let's stop for a moment and let's talk about one of the main impediments or one of the main challenges that arises in terms of the decisions we make. And that is, we are not always reasonable and rational and logical. Even if you are generally speaking reasonable, you also will succumb occasionally to being influenced by non-relevant factors. And this is really understood in a great field, which has been around for the last nearly 50 years or so, or more than 50 years at this stage, called behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is a field in which they really study the psychology of decision making. What they looked at was the old school approach of economics looks as human beings as econs, in other words, as rational decision makers, and suggests the premise that all people will make the best decisions available to them at that moment. But that's not really what always happens. Oftentimes people don't make the best decisions. Why? Well, because they have a brain, and that brain is influenced by lots of other factors. And so what are those factors? Well, a large amount of these factors are things like what we call cognitive biases, as well as emotions that can influence and sway us in different ways, affect our perceptions. And as a result of that, we can make the wrong decision, which can then lead us to creating the kind of results that we certainly did not want. So this sort of psychology of decision making has some great authors, some great books out there. You've got Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work with Amos Tversky, and he's got a great book Kahneman has called Thinking Fast and Slow. Unfortunately, Tversky passed away, so Kahneman lives on both of their legacies through his work. You also have Richard Thaler, who also won a Nobel Prize, again, for work in this area. He's the co-author of Nudge, and he's also, I think, authored a number of books such as Misbehave. You also have Dan Ariely, who has a number of books, including Predictably Irrational. You've got the wonderful Annie Duke, who's written books like How to Decide, but her best, and my favorite, in my opinion at least, is Thinking in Bets. And all of these great authors have explained to us a great deal as to what kind of mistakes we make when we make decisions and how to avoid them. And so we make errors in our decisions because we're human beings with human brains, and with those human brains come human biases. And so what I want to do is just talk you through some of the reasons why we make mistakes. And as we explore each of these, then next week, I'm going to go down into how we can become more critical thinkers and how we can avoid these kind of biases. But even now, as I describe them to you, I want you to be thinking through when you're guilty of making these biases and how you can avoid allowing them to lead you astray in the decisions that you make every single day. So first of all, let's talk about cognitive biases. And there's lots and lots and lots. There's many dozens. There's a couple of hundred different types of cognitive biases that can hold us back or limit our ability to make smart decisions. We have, first of all, just as a few examples I'll give you, confirmation bias. And that is when you look for proof that your conclusion is true, you try to confirm what your belief is. And there's also disconfirmation bias. This is when you look to disconfirm, you look to figure out what's wrong in someone else's theory. And these are kind of biases whereby what we try to do is we limit our ability to be wrong. And Warren Buffett calls this bias, or a version of it, the single biggest reason why people lose money in investments. They don't take in information because they're looking to prove why they're right, or they're dismissing evidence that contradicts their point of view or perspective. And so what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to recognize this confirmation bias, and get into the habit of being okay and comfortable with being wrong. So in other words, whenever you're about to make a decision, notice what your assumptions are, and then start to ask yourself, what if we're wrong about this? What is a totally different way of looking at this? What is a completely different perspective on this? And when you start to do this, when you challenge yourself in this way, and you start to identify and look for the areas where you're wrong, then you can do what Professor Adam Grant talks about, which is you can start to rethink your own assumptions. You can start to challenge your own habitual ways of thinking. By doing so, by rethinking your assumptions, by challenging your own beliefs in what is true, it allows you to open up and potentially open yourself to possible other ways of interpreting a situation, other bits of information, other ideas, which might be a lot more useful for you to be able to do. Next, we have the availability bias. And that is really whenever information is more easily available for us to see or perceive or hear, we're more likely to overvalue that. For example, if something's on the news all the time, we will overvalue how important it is. If we constantly see it in our feeds and social media feeds, we'll constantly overestimate how likely something is to happen. And so to a degree, the more easy it is for us to think of something, or the more easy it is for us to experience something, the more likely we are to overvalue it and feel it is more true or more intense or more powerful. So what's vital for us to recognize is just when we're evaluating the various different elements of evidence, when we're trying to figure out the best decision, recognize when you might have a tendency to weigh something a little bit stronger than others. In other words, give extra weight or give extra credence or extra importance to one particular factor in a decision that you're making. Instead of falling for the trap of assuming because lots of people are talking about something, it must be true, or lots of people are talking about something, therefore it must be super important. Ask yourself the question, is this really important? Is this really a big factor? Is this really critical? Is this really essential? By you being able to ask those questions, it means you're less likely to fall into a trap of the availability bias, whereby you overvalue the things that are just easy for you to access or easy for you to notice or see. The next one is the hindsight bias. And this is the old chestnut where we look back at our decisions in the past and we think to ourselves, oh, it was so obvious. Well, of course it's obvious because with the information now you have, looking back, the hindsight effect means that you're looking back in it with this new way or skewed way of thinking about the past. And so when we're trying to make decisions, it's important for us not to fall into this trap whereby we're thinking about a situation in an erroneous or inaccurate way because of the hindsight bias, because we think to ourselves, oh, well, we should have known this, and therefore you don't want to make the same mistake in the future. By understanding the fact that things will always look different after we figured out how they are resolved than they do beforehand, it can allow us to be able to think things through in a smarter and better way as a result. Then we also have what we call the present bias, and this is really also known as hyperbolic discounting or temporal discounting. This basically means that we overvalue rewards in the present and we undervalue things in the future. So we overvalue how good the cheesecake will feel today, and we undervalue how good the six-pack will feel in 6 months' time. And so what's important for us to realize is that when you're making decisions, particularly strategic decisions, you need to recognize the present bias. You need to understand what are some of the decisions that we need to make today that might not be great today, but will be great in the future. And by visualizing vividly how amazing the future will be, that in turn can help us to be able to make better decisions today. The other problem that we will often face is that oftentimes we'll fall into the trap of making decisions based upon what will solve the problem today. And so it's imperative that in the situations where you think you need to be thinking tactical, that sometimes, especially if you've dealt with that problem over and over again, that instead of thinking tactically, you start to think in terms of strategically. So you think about the possibility of this happening again and again. So what decisions can you make today that avoids this negative experience happening in the future? By learning to do this better, it will allow you to be much more effective in making decisions. And a final cognitive bias, just for now, that I wanted to talk to you about is also known as the Rashomon effect. And the Rashomon effect references an old movie, which was about, I suppose, a murder case. And it was about different characters that all told a story about their experience of it. And it looked at the same murder from multiple perspectives. There's been a few sort of updates or movies connected or based upon this kind of idea. But the Rashomon effect is something which is critical for us to start to recognize, in that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that what we perceive is reality. It's just one version of reality. It's the story that we're telling ourselves. And by recognizing that, it means we can start to open ourselves to other stories, other perspectives, other points of view. By you being able to handle that and recognizing that there are other ways of thinking, other perspectives, other points of view, it enables you to be able to change the way in which you're interacting with the information. And it allows you to be a lot more likely to make better decisions, because you're looking at the same situation from multiple perspectives. You're evaluating how this will benefit you in the long term, or how this will benefit over a period of time as opposed to right now. You're not being swayed by the fact that you assume that everything was obvious afterwards, but instead you're being as diligent as you can about the information that's available to you at the moment, so you can ensure you're making the best and smartest decisions here and now. And that is not based upon what is easy for you to access or understand, but it's based upon when you're looking for all the different factors that are important, you're critically evaluating each factor independently from one another. And it's also about you being able to challenge your own assumptions and be open to other people's perspectives or other people's ways of thinking. If you can start to do that, it can help you to avoid the mistakes that you can always make when it comes to these cognitive biases on your decisions. So as well as these cognitive biases, there's also a number of psychological principles that can influence and impact the way in which we make decisions. And the first one of these is something that Annie Duke talked about in her book, Thinking in Bets, the concept of resulting. And resulting is this phenomenon whereby we evaluate how good a decision is based upon the results we get. But that fails to consider or take into consideration the importance of luck. So you could have a terrible decision-making process, but because of luck, the decision works out well. And therefore you think to yourself, oh, this was great. But instead, you could also have the opposite. You could have the best possible decision-making, but because of bad luck, you don't get the result. So it's really vital that you focus more on the process of decision-making and making sure you're making the best possible decision rather than evaluating that decision based upon the results that you get. Because luck is going to play a part. We don't know how much it's going to play a part sometimes. But just because you get the result, just because you sit down at a slot machine and put $1,000 in and you happen to win, doesn't mean that playing slot machines $1,000 a pop is a good idea. Just because you successfully managed to make it home and you had a few drinks, so you took a bad risk and shouldn't have done that, but just because you successfully managed to get home without injuring yourself or anyone else, doesn't mean that was a good decision. The results should not make us believe that the decision was good. Instead, we should be looking at what was the decision process we engaged in and look and evaluate how good the decision is based on that. When you evaluate your decisions based upon the process as opposed to result, you'll be a lot more likely to make smarter decisions. Another habit that you want to avoid is the habit of thinking in terms of black and white. So the black and white thinking is when we start to look at a situation as in either we do X or we do Y, when in reality, we need to learn to be able to see the gray. Sometimes the right decision is not between the two choices that are presented to us. Sometimes there's a third option. Sometimes we need to be creative in finding a third option. And by doing so, we can make smarter decisions. A third thing that we need to be aware of from a psychological perspective is what's known as truth default theory. And that is the tendency that we have to accept something immediately as true whenever we hear it. Now, obviously, when you've got a skeptical frame of mind or skeptical mindset, you might challenge thoughts as they come in. But generally, on a day-to-day basis, in order for us to function effectively in the world, whenever we hear something, we immediately consider it as being true. And the problem with that is that if someone says something and repeats it, we're sometimes likely to fall for it. So what's imperative is that we always learn to be able to challenge what we're assuming is true in that moment, not a million miles away from the same strategy that helps us with regards to confirmation bias. Next is misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is when we're misinformed about something. We get the wrong information, so we get something that's not factually correct. This could double down with truth default theory in the sense that we're more likely to believe the misinformation we get. But also there's disinformation. There's parties out there using propaganda or whatnot to be able to, from a malevolent perspective, to try to convince us of something that isn't true, to manipulate us towards taking action that serves their best interests. And so what we need to do is recognize the sources that we're looking at for the evidence and for the factors that are going to help us to make the decisions that we're making, and learn to challenge those sources and not allow those sources to be able to skew our decisions in an unfavorable way, or at least a way which negatively impacts our future results. So what we want to be able to do is recognize misinformation and disinformation by understanding the source and being able to verify whatever information we're using to make evaluations. And then lastly, there's perceived value. This is really that a lot of times when we're deciding on what decision, what course of action to engage in, oftentimes what we can do is recognize, or fail to recognize rather, that value is something that is cultivated or created in our mind. So often, whenever we buy something that we don't need, it's because the salesperson or the marketing team that has promoted the product to us has in some way created a massive amount of perceived value. And what we need to be able to do is sift through that perception and figure out, will what the perceived value that they're communicating, will that line up with the value that will actually give for you? So are you buying it because they've made you want it, or are you buying it because it will actually provide you with the enjoyment or the results that you're looking for, depending on what kind of buy you are making at that moment in time. So all of these are different psychological factors that can influence and affect the decisions that we make. The final few biases that affect us are emotional biases. And the first of these is what we call tilt. And tilt is a sort of a term used to describe the impact that emotions can have on our decisions. Whenever we experience tilt, what happens to us is we're influenced and impacted by whatever's going on at that moment in time. And as a result of that, we're, let's say, triggered to the point where we're more likely to make decisions out of the wrong kind of state. So we could be tilted into anger, tilted into fear, tilted into frustration, tilted into feeling sad. And as a result of being in those emotional states will negatively impact the way in which we're able to think in a rational and smart and reasonable way. There's also the overconfidence effect, which is also known as a bias. And this is really whenever we feel like we already know everything, as a result of that, we just assume we're correct. This overconfidence means that we stop ourselves from listening to other perspectives, which can then interfere with our ability to be able to make smart decisions. There's motivated reasoning. This is whenever we want to believe something, so we decide to. And even though there's information that tries to say we're not, we really want to believe in something. And as a result of that, we don't make decisions based on the facts. We make decisions based upon what we want to believe in that moment, which is not always a good way to go. There's also loss aversion, and this is our tendency as human beings to be able to be more focused and more concerned and more worried with what we have to lose than what we have to gain. So overall, if we look at human beings, we are more likely to be more concerned, to be more motivated by avoiding losing what we don't want to lose, as opposed to gaining what we necessarily don't have. And so this is critical in terms of framing a decision to ourselves. If we talk about what are we going to miss out on if we don't make this decision, well, that's going to make us more likely to make the decision. Whereas if we turn around and say, what will we gain if we make this decision? Ultimately speaking, even though they might be the same things, it's not going to be as motivating to us in that context. So we have to be as clever as we can as to how we're going to avoid loss aversion, if you'll excuse the kind of meta way of explaining it there. You don't want to experience loss aversion because it's terrible. You will lose your ability to think rationally. See what I did there? Anyway, the halo and the horns effect is another couple of emotional biases we have. Whenever we meet someone, we find a connection with someone, we like something about them, we're more likely to see them as smarter, better looking, more trustworthy, all those factors. And similarly too, if they support a different sports team than us, or there's something about them we don't like, or we feel disconnected from them, the horns effect can mean that we immediately reduce how intelligent they are in our own minds, and we dismiss them in a number of ways. So again, we need to be aware of when this happens so that it doesn't negatively impede our ability to make decisions. And then there's the negativity bias, the tendency we have as human beings to always focus on what might go wrong and always focus on the negative. Because once again, back in the hunter-gatherer days, our brains needed to be able to pay attention to dangers, not necessarily when things went right. So all of these are just examples of emotional biases and psychological principles and cognitive biases that can get in our way. I'm sure at a later point in a different podcast episode, I'll talk through more of these. I know in some of the ones in the past, we've looked at these. But it's important for you to, number one, be aware of these possible impacts. You need to be aware of the kinds of biases that might lead you astray. And by recognizing them, then do what you need to do. Do your due diligence to ensure that these biases are not dictating the kind of decision that you make. When you recognize your emotional biases, when you recognize your cognitive biases, when you recognize these psychological practices or factors at play, it can really help you to overcome the likelihood of falling into the trap of making a decision which isn't inherently the best possible decision. So that's all for now. Next week, we're going to get into the second part of making decisions. We'll talk about critical thinking. We'll talk about some decision-making approaches, how to think faster and make better decisions faster. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. And may everything this week be the best it can possibly be for you. May the force continue to be with you, and may you continue to believe better. I'll see you for part 2 very, very soon. Bye for now.